So we are now recording so that others can come and enjoy it, or better yet, Janie later can relive it when she sees it again. Okay.
I'm in the right outfit tonight.
Well, good. Okay, and do you all see the funny little screen now with the Rock'em Sock'em robots?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm going to go over here and minimize everybody so I can see a little bit better.
Put it forward.
Okay. Well, just to play a little bit here, the reason why I picked this is we sort of left last time with the great question of, but how do we actually make this happen? How do we accomplish this whole sort of a thing that we're hoping to see done? And part of what I wanted to say here with us is, we do seem to be back here. I love this toy. If you've not had this as a child, you've really missed out. This is Rock'em Sock'em robots. The only thing you do is you try and hit the other guy so hard with the robot that his head flies off. And that's kind of what we kind of left this with. And this idea this week that we're talking about is the second democracy. And it's not defined yet until we get into the readings. Pardon me, but it's a question that there's the democracy that's simply the political system we have, but there's another democracy, the democracy that is the one that unifies us and the one that gives us a purpose and an opportunity. And you may remember last week, and I began, unfortunately, only showing you the little thing that hangs in my office. This is what I have inside my office here that I wanted us to be able to see. This is Charles Gore, and this is one of the guiding principles of my ministry. The Christian effort, he says, for social improvement aims always at the regeneration and sanctification of individual characters and not the reordering of society. He says Christ alone in direct, quickening grace can restore the moral health of individuals, but there are preliminary obstacles of the influences to be removed: bad dwellings, inadequate wages, inadequate education, inability to use leisure. These stones were laid upon the graves of men spiritually dead. We must take away the stones. Only we shall not exaggerate what merely external reforms is likely to accomplish. The real obstacle to social advance is selfishness or sin. No external reform will move this, nothing but the conversion of souls from self to God. And in my eyes, this is part of what I'm going to put forward again. And this lovely lady serving me a brownie, Deborah here, told me that when I do things, I got to make sure to tell you what I'm going to tell you, and then tell you what I told you. So I want to begin here today by clearly saying that the answer to our solution here lies inside the individual moral compass and the conscience, and how we play upon our own, and how we seek to not only find, but to nurture that of others. And in no small way, I truly believe that this thing of Gore's that I personally think is the only way for us to try and be socially just, is at the heart of how things can go forward for us as a Christian community and as individuals in our broader community. This week, when we began talking with Needleman, one of the things he begins is talking about wounds and turnings, and this idea he's trying to lay for us on what it is that is the setting we go forward on. Again, he's a historian, but he's a philosopher of history. He doesn't just simply look at history and find, as I do as an historian, examples, lessons, and models. What he also does is that he actually asks the question of what history is in and of itself. And here he kind of begins with that. This quote here that says, talking about what it was the Civil War meant to us. At the same time, he said, there exists ever increasing hope that the wound of slavery would be healed in the passage of time. Hope in America, he says. But there is another aspect of this wound that will not and should not ever heal. Okay, this is interesting. Don't we want our wounds to heal? What he says here is it has to do with almost entirely with the death of Lincoln himself, Lincoln, he says, never lived to see the results of his struggle and never lived to govern in America at peace. And yet, speaking now of this trip he took to the Lincoln Memorial, at this memorial, one feels without any sentimentality that we are being watched. He tells us that Lincoln comes to represent the deeply mysterious power of what he calls the look of seeing, imagining that we are subject in a way to the eyes of history looking upon us and expecting us to live up to the paths that they have paved for us to get to where we are. Okay, brief excursus, just because this is one of the greatest books to encapsulate what he's driving at in the next couple of sentences about, next couple of slides about Lincoln. And the book, it's a plug for the book by Martha Hode's, Mourning Lincoln. It is much anthropology as history to really dig in. And this is a quote from the New York Times. Martha Hodes brings to life a key moment of national uncertainty and confusion when competing visions of America's future proved irreconcilable and hopes for racial justice in the aftermath of the Civil War slipped from the nation's grasp. Hodes masterfully brings the tragedy of Lincoln's assassination alive in human terms that continue to stagger and rivet us 150 years after the events they so strikingly describe. So again, this isn't just sort of a travel log of his funeral or something like that. This is a really incredible book that digs into the impact of what, for many of us, for much of America, was more of a turning point and a seminal point of the 1860s than perhaps even the Civil War itself, because we had an idea of what we wanted from the Civil War. But what she comes up with is this notion that Lincoln's death not only elevated him to a nearly deified state, becoming sort of the national conscience at this time, but it also raised for America at the time and still today this sense of the uncompleted role. You know, what would have happened had we had Reconstruction and Reconstruction underneath someone with the intellect and the sensibilities of a Lincoln. But I highly recommend the book, and you may find it, I hope, interesting. Mourning Lincoln by Hodes. But he talks about the look, and I've gotten this image from the Lincoln Memorial. He says this look, it teaches us, this monument, not so much that the dead hero sees us, but that there is a seeing that is like death itself, invisible, all pervasive, without any capacity or even wish to act or do, yet with an irresistible power to penetrate and influence that which is seen, without words, without conceptualization, and without manipulation. So we see in this moment here, this idea that somehow this man in this monument, this face that I put here to the right of the screen, and I'll bring Pat Callhop in to join us here, but this person is essentially the conscience of history, drawing us into this next phase of what do we do, how do we do it, and telling us that this has been done and been paid for, and it's our responsibility to follow him. Bear with me here as now, he draws out from here, and if you've been to the Lincoln Memorial, you know this is one of the sides, areas of the memorial. And in it is his second inaugural address. Now he says here, I think rather wisely, in the Gettysburg Address, the people as an entity was consecrated as a whole. In the inaugural address, in this particular setting that we're looking at now, we see that it's sins is solidarity as well. I would encourage you, if you've never really studied, to look at Lincoln's second inaugural address. His first one lasted many minutes. His second one was done almost, but not quite, almost as briefly as the Gettysburg Address. And in it, instead of gloating over the imminent vanquishing of the Confederate forces, Lincoln essentially makes everyone wear the mantle of not only the war, but slavery as well. And as such, makes it that none of us can gloat. The idea of the victory is really everyone's victory, the reunification of the country, but the fault of the war lays in the entire country. And as such, the second inaugural address is really a great, brilliant tactic of trying to heal the country by making us all unified in our sins as well as our accomplishments. He says here also, the wound of the war is interpreted as washing away the sins of the people and opening the path to a second chance. As he says in there, he says a new birth of freedom. Now, he turns to the other side of the monument and sees there the Gettysburg Address. And in it, he finds this idea of a common commitment and responsibility. Again, this is Lincoln looking at us and telling us what we have to do, taking from that eminently brief but eminently complete address of the Gettysburg Address. He says, "It is for us the living rather than to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which those who died in that battle of Gettysburg, they who fought here have thus so far so nobly advanced, that we here highly resolve that the dead shall not have died in vain." And there's that sense of the look of the dead, the looking, the seeing, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. And so these two together, he brings up and says, this is about a unifying and a healing. Now, this is not to pick on the baby boomers, what happens next, and not to pick on the Vietnam War veterans or anyone that we look at it, but he then raises up the Vietnam Memorial, which is almost adjacent to the Lincoln Memorial, and talks about how it is the only such monument in Washington, and perhaps in all the world. It does not soar or rise upward. It is not positive. It recedes. It opens downward. It is an absence, like a permanent wound. And I took this particular image because it shows it like a gash in the ground of the area around the mall. And in it, he says that there's this dark mirror of the conscience. The Civil War did not break America's heart, but Vietnam did. It said, when the heart weeps for, it is said that when a heart weeps for what is lost, the spirit laughs for what it has found. And he says another older saying has it that the body is the temple of God, but the throne of God is built in the ruins of the heart. And of course, I'm thinking of the 51st Psalm that says, that God does not want sacrifices of bullocks and things. What he wants is a broken and contrite heart. And it says here, could it be, this is Needleman speaking, could it be that a healing drop of deep psychological ruin has entered the bloodstream of America? After 200 years in its accelerated outward motion, is America again ready to make room for the dark mirror of conscience with its attendant sorrow and its all-embracing light? So as we enter into this section, I think what I really kind of want us to stop and ponder is one of the things that we can enjoy, in the sense not like this is a lot of fun, but that we can take joy in, is knowing that if we seem like that our nation is so gashed and wounded, like the Civil War, it takes us the opportunity to both share in the tragedy and the triumph of this moment, of this aching moment. And so he says here, looking at this, it's like the legacy of a broken heart. He says the Vietnam War destroyed the meaning of America for millions of the rest of us. Wasn't Vietnam the wound that finally destroyed the illusion of America? This illusion meaning the sort of coming off of World War II with an almost blithe sense that we were the good guys and that we were the ones that won on the side of God and goodness. The response through the ages has been to acknowledge that suddenly a channel has been opened between oneself and truth. And can this be so also for a whole nation? Suggesting that maybe what we were encountering here is not the demise of our country, but in its unhappiness, the opportunity for us to be able to really make those sort of connections and look ahead as we would want to. So he suggests then this way home. He says here on page 281, if the government of the United States of America and her people has lost its way, let the way itself be remembered and seen even as we collectively fall so far from it. He's calling us again to those founding fathers to relish and to be excited about the message that they give us. Let the forms we have, the words we use, sound again their ideal meaning, so that we can know again and with renewed clarity what it is we are searching for, what we wish for, and why. In the not too distant future, if it doesn't get picked up by the book club, I'm going to do a separate book study on a book that I'm delving into again right now. I just think it's important to fit into this ideal. It's The Boys in the Boat. And it's the story about the 1936 Olympic rowing team that came from Washington State, University of Washington, that won the Olympics. During the heights of the Depression, a bunch of kids that had nothing but character and ability. And part of what I loved in this was this one guy who at 10 years old had been abandoned by his mother and father and his half siblings because they just didn't have enough food to feed. And this kid decided that what he was going to do was he could feel sorry for himself, he could be angry at his parents, or he could start making his life. Because as he told his fiance years later, anger takes energy. And what I needed to do was I needed to solve my problems, not merely be angry at the injustices that have been meted out to me. And he's gone to university, he's found this woman he loves and is engaged to her, and he's building this tremendous opportunity. And I think it's a story that we can encompass in ourselves. We do see injustices, but if we mire ourselves only in the injustices and become enraged at them, then they become our focus. And they become something external to us and far away and intractable. But if we can look inside of ourselves, if we can find our own place in our own heartbreak, then our conscience can speak to us and we can begin to do things for ourselves. And we can begin on an individual level thinking about Gore again for a conversion that we can then begin to spread to other individuals, just like the apostles spread the message of Christ. Spread it quite rapidly, I might add. And for them, it was the same thing. It wasn't just the idea of Jesus or the world's problems. It was about talking to people about fundamentally a personal experience with a living person that they were inviting them to have life with as well. He says we need to reconnect with freedom that we've already discussed, this idea of freedom, not just to do what we want, but freedom that makes us everything we want and are called to be so that we can give that away. Individuality that is about what and who we are as opposed to getting what we want and to have our way. Democracy that isn't about just majority rules of getting that majority's preferences, but a majority rule that takes into account listening to both sides and allowing that balance. He says in kind of this lead up to the conclusion on page 282, there is a certain wisdom of humanity which is common to the greatest men with the lowest, in which our ordinary education offers often labors to silence and obstruct. The idea that there is not a dichotomy, a sort of black and white, yes, this way, no, that way, but beginning to think that together we might be able to find in a more open and democratic way an understanding that things are different. I wanted to spend a little bit of time here, but I couldn't really find a way to do this without taking too much time. But a good example that he made was talking about being at Monticello and looking at Monticello. He said, on the one hand, you had Jefferson, and Jefferson's idea, and this is, kind of like the old Federalist Papers arguments, because on the one hand, you had Jefferson that thought that you didn't want a person that worked for a salary to be able to vote because he was afraid they would be wage slaves. This idea that an individual who was beholden to somebody else for money, be it a customer, be it an employer, would not be as free as the person who was an agrarian farmer. On the other hand, of course, you had Hamilton and his ideas of the village, the city, the town, and what it brought in its own perspectives. These two guys were never eye to eye. But at the same time, and poor Hamilton didn't know how to be eye to eye with other people that put bullets in him. But what was the name of that guy anyway? Burr.
Burr.
Raymond Burr, thank you.
Aaron Burr.
Aaron Burr. Raymond Burr was Ironsides, the guy in the wheelchair, right?
Aaron.
Anyway, oh God, my television youth coming out. But you know, these two are some sort of people that can tell us that these managed to cooperate even as they so strongly opposed each other. And of course, you know, Jefferson was this agrarian, and Hamilton was the beginning of commerce. He was our first Secretary of the Treasury, invented the American banking system. And I take this poignant photograph of the 1960s to kind of round out this little section for us. Democracy, the democracy inside a democracy. Of course, this fellow taking the American flag as a weapon against this African American. Question is, he says, can the ideals of democracy remind us that we need to become what John Dewey called the democratic individual? You see where I'm going again? Now we're leaving this idea of a mass reform and taking it down to the individual. The second democracy is the democracy inside ourselves, our willingness to open up a dialogue internally that will foster a dialogue outside of us. He says here about the democratic individual, men and women who are inwardly democratic, who are able to step back from the personal emotions in order to allow the other to think and speak and live. And what are we seeing so horribly played out in our society today? The inability to listen to someone. And he suggests, and I agree, and I think Gore agrees with us, is that it begins by allowing ourselves internally, not trying to solve the world's problems, settling our own openness to dialogue, to democratic dialogue. The last sentence here, democracy in this sense refers not only to our outer form of government, but to a power within the self. Now he brings up here Ephrata. This is a community in Pennsylvania, about, I think it was 60 miles outside of Philadelphia, to the west of Philadelphia. This photograph on the left shows what they looked like back in the day. Ephrata, a little bit like the Shakers, were a male-female celibate, evangelical, monastic community that was purely American. They had come to America to find religious freedom. Bissell and this, Johann Conrad Bissell in 1730. And it was a community of both men and women who were based around this idea of love for each other, of openness to each other, respect and dignity for all people. In an age in which women couldn't have property, they enjoyed complete equality inside the Ephrata community. Ephrata, by the way, I think I say another slide, is the ancient Hebrew word that is Bethlehem. This is coming out to be another nativity for them, a new place to come in, and it's an important example. He gives a wonderful, he cites a wonderful example at the very beginning of how this really played out. There was this fellow, I love the way he put it, a certain Michael Widman. He was sort of somebody that didn't like his neighbors. He lived close to the Ephrata community, and he always had a bad thing to say about them. He was this sort of a loudmouth bar man who kind of got himself into trouble. And one day what happened was 2 noted spies from the British Army had come inside, and he had no problems telling the British spies that he thought that the British general was a total jerk. And when they were about to pull their guns out and shoot him, he ran away. Now, after spending the night, guess where? At the Ephrata community, the one place he thought he could hide out. He thought that what he had to do was go make peace with the British general. So he makes his way and demands and begs for an audience with the British general. And he essentially throws the entire colonial idea under the bus. I don't believe in this stuff. I'm sorry, I'm a loyal Englishman now. And the general, in an immense amount of wisdom, looks at him and says, I don't need to punish you for anything. You have just publicly been a traitor, and I have no use for you. And I wager that the colonials will have no use for you. So instead of incarcerating him or killing him, he simply releases him on the other side of the lines back into the colonial hands. He instantly falls into trouble. He's in Washington's prison, George Washington's prison, and he's facing being executed now by the very people he thought he could turn his back on in order to save his life. Now, this guy word gets out who he is, what's happening. And what happens is Peter Miller, who is essentially the prior, the man who runs the day-to-day operations of the Ephrata community, in a blizzard, 60 miles, walks to speak to George Washington to plead for Michael Whitman's release. He comes in and speaks to him, and what we're told is that when this appeal from Miller ends, Washington wept. And he took him by the hand and he said, "Dear friend," this is Washington speaking, "I thank you for this lesson of Christian charity. I cannot resist such a manifestation of our divine religion. The pardon for Whitman is granted on one condition, that you be the bearer of it yourself." And so what happens next is Miller takes this written pardon and goes to Whitman and essentially says to him, and before he can get it, it's like the prodigal son. Before he can say anything, this man begins to apologize. He knows he's a dead man. He knows he's dead. And he's telling this man, "I have always been bad to you people over there at Ephrata. I'm so terribly sorry. I have been humbled. And I think I really kind of encompass what my problem here is." And what happens is the commander of the prison goes, "I think you need to shut up because you're saved. And this is the guy that saved you." And if you look at both sides of this rather adorable story, what we kind of come up with is an understanding that, as it says here, that moment when the monk and the commander-in-chief stood face to face, when two worlds faced each other, may serve as a symbol of our outer and the inner meaning of the American democracy. The general, Washington, says Needleman, yielded to the monk and allowed another influence to enter the war of revolution. It made sense to Washington to execute a traitor. But Washington was made to see a different way, that there was someone there that could be redeemed to the cause. A similar kind of influence, says Needleman, needs now to re-enter the life of America, calling us back to the vertical meaning of the ideas of independent, liberty, and democratic community. We need to understand democracy not only as an outer political form, but as an inner human ideal. And this is something that's truly wonderful, because again, the onus comes on to us to try and be the reconcilers and the redeemers. He goes in a little bit deeper on this idea because he thinks that Ephrata actually becomes, in many ways, emblematic of the American beginnings and potentials. Again, this is some of the buildings of the community. It was known as the Ephrata Cloister. Again, it's very funny to see something that so adopts the principles of Roman Catholic in general, monasticism, and makes it both American and Protestant. He says here, America came into being as an experiment in joining mysticism and pragmatism, in joining the part of man that speaks union with God and the part that must act in the outer world of social responsibility and material necessity. A communal experiment such as Ephrata can show us the origins of the American nation lie in the struggle between the mystical and the pragmatic impulses of human nature, enabling us to see that this struggle lies at the root of American value structure. It can help us to understand more precisely where that structure has become distorted and in what direction we actually need to turn to call back the hope for humanity that was reflected in our origins. And he talks about what was the essence of this place, this Ephrata essence. He says the central thrust of that community was the notion that within the psyche, the mind of every man and woman were their slumbers and an untapped capacity to love and to understand. We have that in us. And this is interesting because what we would hear is, in the words of Gore, it would be to turn us from self to God. Because that's what God is, this idea of disinterested, self-giving love, agape in the Greek there to the right. That is the kind of love that God has for humanity. He says, in the awakening of these capacities and in their expression for good of others, for the good of others, lies the chief meaning of human life. This is what Ephratah tried to be. And he said the community assumed the name Ephratah, the pre-Israelite name for Bethlehem, indicative of Beesel's aim, like that of many of America's first settlers, to build a new Israel in the New World. If you're familiar with Jonathan Winthrop and the early Massachusetts settlements, the Arbella speech talks about making a city on the hill, very apocalyptic ideas of America as being the time we're going to finally get it right. So what for Ephratah was a real person? This is Needleman describing. He says, we need to see what a human being is, the human being independent of all distinctions of sex, race, ethical background, wealth, physical or mental prowess. This is what they try to aspire to in this community. What we can do is what we have in our heart. We need to see that a human being is, and the real possibilities of man really are, as well as what his real failings may be. It's not idealistic. It's not panacea here. It is at this level that people can be really united, when we can see our links of differences, our failures, as well as our nobility. The deeper meaning of democracy can be seen only by understanding the deeper structure of the human self. That sort of introspection. I love that picture, by the way, that poor man looking inside somebody's eyeball. But it does encompass for us this idea of being introspective for ourselves and for others, to look inside them and to see something other than what for the outside we might imagine. And this is the heart of the way God looks at us. I mean, as Christians, we embrace the notion that God looks at us not with the eyes of accusation, but with the eyes of the Redeemer that sees in us that which can die and be made something wonderful when it's resurrected. And we see that then, this duality, again, I keep bringing back the statue, the idea of the two sides of humanity struggling like wrestlers. The idea of the second democracy, says Needleman, shows us that what all men and women have in common are the possibility and the necessity of a specific kind of struggle within themselves. It is the struggle between the two natures of man that we all share, something we have utterly in common. And it's this possibility which must be respected. At our diocesan convention, and I don't mean to hammer my poor bishop, but I want to say this clearly. At our diocesan convention this last fall, the bishop, and I strongly disagree with him, and here I think I've got Needleman on my side. He said that the myth that there's more that unites us than divides us has to be forgotten. And I think that there are many things that divide us, but even if this is it, if this is the one thing that unites us in commonality, this is at the very heart and root of the human identity. Everything that emanates out of us, differences of opinion, difference of mores, all the other things that may influence us, find at its heart the fact that we as all human beings are at struggle inside of ourselves with a second democracy of trying to make the right decision in and of ourselves. And that unity is something that should attract us and that should make us feel unified. Like Lincoln said in the second inaugural address, we're unified not only in this victory, but in the causes of this war. He uses an example here, Biesel, which we've already heard mentioned, the founder of this order, had an alternative. Now, Biesel, as he says here, keeps showing his community the aim of simultaneously opening to God and acting in a world is impossible. So it's like you've got to go apart. That's the whole idea of this monastic community. We're going to go over here and we're going to get it right. It's almost what people did in coming to America. We're going to leave bad old England and or bad old wherever. And we're going to come here to the United States, to America, and here we're going to get it right. But it says this is what must be done. We have to go out into the world. Now, he had this fellow that worked with him. He was a previous prior, Eckerling. And Eckerling wanted to turn away from the struggle to submit to conscience. And him, this turning away manifested itself in an unbalanced faith in his own individual ability to master the external environment and the social structures of the community. At the heart of this, which sounds materialistic, but it's not, Eckerling wanted to, they were like a lot of these things, like the Shakers themselves, they were very successful in producing crops and producing carpentry items and producing so many things that they began to have really wonderful, successful trade with the world around them. But unfortunately, this put them in contact with the world around them. And Wiesel saw the whole thing about trying to get away from folks and being a separate community. And Eckerling thought, we've got to reintegrate ourselves into the community. And this tension is not a thing that alone he wants to get rid of. Indeed, he thinks playing these two things out inside this community of Ephrata was actually where we're trying to go. So what he says here is, the American ideal of independence cannot mean, and never did mean for the most thoughtful of the founding fathers, freedom from duty to God, nor did it mean the illusion of autonomy that results from manipulating nature solely to gratify the desires of the ego in its undisciplined body. Nor did the ideal of democratic community imply the obligation to honor the rights of man's passing fears and cravings. This really talked to me today because I already read this. I was thinking about how much this sounds like cancel culture. I mean, if somebody really going to get offended about Pepe Le Pew, the cartoon character, do we feed into that fear and apprehensions? Or do we try and do something? Is it enough? It's not enough just to cave in to people. Listening to them and letting them rule the body politic, just as in unregenerate man, they rule the individual psyche.
I bought her.
So he says the ideal of democratic community implied, on the contrary, the obligation of all to respect each individual conscience, either man's or woman's effort to listen to conscience by means of the cultivation of a mature quality of reason and moral sensibility. Again, trying to create something.
Period.
So at the very end of Wiesel and Eckerling, the idea of independence began as the freedom of a man and woman to submit to the will of God within. Having begun as that in the teachings of Conrad Wiesel, it became under Eckerling the freedom to obey one's own subjective understanding and impose it on others in the name of God.
Mm-hmm.
And when that happens, of course, that's when it slips through our fingers and freedom goes away.
Wow.
On the other hand, looking here at democracy, this idea of the inner soul that we listen to in the second democracy is the soul of the first democracy. We need to have that inner dialogue and inner openness and inner listening to the other voice and settling what is right before we can also do that out in the world. Our democracy, our world. The second democracy, the community based on the equality of all men who search for conscience, requires the political and social reform and external tolerance that are provided by the kind of democratic society Americans now live in, and whose principles were so carefully crafted in Philadelphia. The Constitution was made. It remained for the mystical communities of America, and none more than Ephrata community, to create specially defined communal organizations for the purpose of spiritual transformation. And again, I hope you see and hear this idea that I keep wanting to come back to. I never brought this book to you guys as being a political book or an historical book. It always wants to loop back around for us to this notion that really what we're looking at in our society is looking at ways in which we already want to try and engage as Christians in our own spiritual life and in our community life as a church. Now he leaves here and goes to what I hope some of you, if not all of you, will really appreciate, the man of Walt Whitman. He calls him the greatest of the American prophets. And he certainly looks like a prophet, doesn't he? I mean, you can't put a bearded man like that out. Yeah, there's a wonderful movie, if you've not seen it, with Robin Williams, called The Dead Poet Society. And in it, he asked one of his students to describe him. He says he looks like a sweaty-toothed madman. And I think it's spot on. But Whitman was also an incredible essayist. We don't hear about those as much because, of course, Leaves of Grass is such an incredible collection of poems and such an epochal sort of American identity of this reimagining of the post-Civil War years. If you don't know about him, he was, I'm going to slip over to the next image. This is him as a young man and looking just ever bit like he's just about to go be a sweaty-toothed man when he gets the spare time. But this image of Whitman, he was a nurse during the American Civil War. He had several infirmities, and he was also a pacifist. He did not, but the man had an incredible love for Lincoln. His testament to the death of Lincoln was the poem, "O Captain, My Captain." To Whitman, who was by then emerging as America's greatest visionary poet, 20 years afterwards, after the events of the assassination of Lincoln, he says that Lincoln incarnated the essence of American democracy, the harmonious blending of the mystical and the pragmatic within the individual soul. The way that he described him was this one time when he had seen him going by in a carriage when he was a nurse in Washington, and he saw President Lincoln go by. And it was one of these things where he caught him in his eyes and saw the look in his eyes as he looked down at this passing person. In that moment, that very self-aware, very poetical person of Walt Whitman, he describes in this way. He said, I should say the invisible foundations and vertebrae of his character, more than any man's in history, were mystical, abstract, moral, and spiritual. Why upon all of them was built, and out of all of them was radiated, under the control of the average circumstances, what the vulgar call horse sense. In a life often bent on temporary but most urgent materialistic and political reasons. Just looking at the man's face, he could be able to read the fact that there was the mystic and the pragmatic that exist together. Now, he spends a good deal of time, Needleman, going over, and I'm just going to share some quotes, not from Needleman here, as opposed to quotes from the essay by Walt Whitman, The Democratic Vistas. What Whitman says here is, for I say, the true nationality of the states, here meaning United States, the genuine union, when we come to a moral crisis, is and is to be, after all, neither the written law, nor as generally supposed either self-interest or common pecuniary or material objects, but the fervent and tremendous idea, melting everything else with resistless heat, and solving all lesser and indefinite distinctions in vast, indefinite spiritual, emotional power. Now that's a poet writing an essay, talking to us and saying that though we may think that what we're going to gravitate to when hard times come, and we're in hard times, is to personal gain or self-interest or some other sort of, he says, no, what we need most and what will save us are ideas. And the ideas that we bring to bear internally and externally. He goes on to say the purpose of democracy, this is again Whitman, is that man, properly trained in sanest, highest freedom, the one we've been hearing talked about in our conversations, may and must become a law, a series of law unto himself, surrounding and providing for not only his own personal control, but all his relations and to other individuals and to the state. This idea of this conscience that he's drawing out for us, that says that Whitman thinks this is the moral compass that only comes when we have these debates and come to these new laws inside of ourselves. He says then equality, our idea of equality, is a trace, an echo of the ancient doctrine of inner transcendence that was brought to the world by the teachings of wisdom. Democracy, this is Whitman, not Whitman, but Needleman. Democracy serves its deeper purpose to allow men and women to seek contact with their inherent transcendence. And if we find it there, that we can expect and trust it in others. Again, this is looking at our fellow man and seeing the board in our own eye, as Christ would say, before we look and see the cinder in theirs. There's the Fasties again. This is Needleman. The people, he says, is not the crowd, and the individual is not the ego. It's the ego and the mob, that's what I would say, but the crowd that oppose each other. The individual is not the ego, and the people are not the crowd. It's something else that is unified. This idea of as individuals, we're bound together as a one, which is stronger than our individual parts. We then see inside Whitman again, this idea of an American religion then. And now as a priest, there's a part of me that wants to sit there and say, yeah, but let me let him speak for himself. He says, the rightness of religion is doubtless to be looked for in the field of the individuality. And it is a result that no organization or church can ever achieve. And I'll go along with them there. I really mean that. Because the idea is, like we just heard said or saw earlier by Gore, the individual conversion. In order to have anything authentic in church, any sort of authentic morality, this has to happen inside of us. We have to know Jesus personally to be able to have any sort of authentic ideal when we come to speak about Christ communally. He says religion, although casually arrested and after a fashion preserved in churches and creeds, does not depend at all upon them, but is a part of the identified soul, which, when greatest, knows not Bibles in the old way, but in a new way, the identified soul, which can really confront religion when it extricates itself entirely from the churches and not before. I think you can go back to church, but I think it has to first come from a sincere, and sometimes you may find it. I think what Whitman doesn't realize is that you can fake it till you make it. There was an old professor of mine that used to say that not that long ago, people believed and they went to church. What we see now is people go to church to believe. They go to find out what it's all about. The context now is somewhat changing, I think. And I think that once you hear and you become accustomed to it, then like the evangelical Protestants will say, and then we want to call you into a personal relationship with Jesus. I think that still does happen. So what is this quest? Whitman says, only here communion, the mysteries, the problems wither, alone and identity in the mood, and the soul emerges, and all statements, churches, sermons melt away like vapor, alone in silence, thought and awe and aspiration, and then the interior consciousness, like a hitherto unseen inscription in magic ink, beams out its wondrous lines to the sense. Bible may convey and priest may expound, but it is exclusively in the noiseless operations of one's isolated self to enter the pure ether of veneration, reach the divine levels, and commune with the unutterable. Amen. Because you can go to church, but it's when it comes into your heart on a one-to-one relationship with God that it becomes real. And with that, he says, to practically enter into politics is an important part of American personalism. He speaks of personalism in the same way that Needleman speaks of individuality, as opposed to individualism, which Needleman decries. Some may, says Whitman, decry the whole formulation of active politics of America as beyond redemption. Does this sound familiar to like this morning's news? And to be carefully kept away from. See that you do not fall into this error. America, it may be, is doing very well upon the whole, notwithstanding these antics of the parties and their leaders, these half-brained nominees and the many ignorant ballots and the many elected failures and blatherers. It is the dilettantes and all who shirk their duty who are not doing well. As for you, I advise you to enter more strongly yet into politics. He says here, I think very truthfully, disengage yourself from parties. They have been useful and to some extent remain so, but the floating uncommitted electors, farmers, clerks, mechanics, and masters of parties, watching aloof, incline victory this side or that. Such are the ones most needed, present and future. For America, if eligible at all to downfall and ruin, is eligible within herself, not without. For I see clearly that the combined foreign world could not beat her down, but by implication, we can kill ourselves. But these savage, wolfish parties alarm me, owning no law but their own will, more and more combative, less and less tolerant of the ideas of ensemble and an equal brotherhood. Wow, Yeah, this was over 100 years ago. The perfect equality of the states, the overarching American ideals. It behooves you to convey yourself implicitly to no party, nor submit blindly to their dictators, but steadily hold yourself judge and master over all of them.
That's good.
And then where do we find ourselves back again? Back to Charles Gore. And we see again this idea that Christ alone in direct quickening grace can restore the moral health of individuals. But there are preliminary obstacles, and there's still things we need to work on. We're not putting our head in the sand. We're not navel gazers. But we begin by seeing things inside of ourselves and saying, this is where we find our moral compass to act. Only we shall not exaggerate the merely external reforms as likely to accomplish the real obstacle to social advancements is selfishness and sin. No external reform will remove this, nothing but the conversion of souls from self to God. And that, my very dear friends, is, see if I can now stop sharing. We come back and see each other. Hello.
Hello.
So that's where we are right now. We still have the conclusions, which we'll do next week. But what did you all think about it? I kind of, as I love to do, talk a blue streak. Thank you, David. I'm always glad you're within arm's reach of me.
Keep your conscience.
I just don't know which one of us is Abbott and which one's Costello. But
Interchangeable.
Right.
I'm wearing a fancy shirt though, so I guess anyway. But no, I think what do you all think about this? How has this reached to you? What do you think about this week's selections here?
I enjoyed them.
I don't think can you hear me? I don't know if
Yes, we can.
Yes. Okay, because I'm on a different device.
We hear you.
I'm down in Florida and I'm on an iPad and I love it. I just think you are an incredible historian, number one, and lecturer. And it's sometimes extremely deep, but that's good. Answers a lot of questions, sometimes deep within me. And I'm so happy you did this and that I can still continue with you because of Zoom.
Yeah.
We had our vestry meeting a week ago, and one of the things that we said was online's here to stay. I was just telling Peter Trapp before y'all got on, I hope that we look better than we did before because we've made an investment in some equipment, little better cameras and things like that. So our Sunday services and things like this look a little sharper, have a little better quality.
That's very good quality. Good.
I can even see Deborah cutting some food back there.
We call it brownie.
Hi, Deborah.
Second brownie.
Sorry.
Who's counting?
Yeah.
Well, it's nice you could do it either way,
Yeah.
I probably would now that I've had 2 vaccinations, maybe come down to the church if I was home.
Well, we'll see you hopefully by summer, right?
Oh yeah, by May.
One of the
I
things
had a wonderful day with Carter. You and Deborah would like to know.
Yes,
It was really great.
our
Oh,
daughter's
I'll
good.
share it with you another time.
Okay.
Great.
One of the things
Anyway,
one of the things I wanted to mention about this context for us though is I think to me last time we met, we left with the question of, okay, this is great, I buy into it, but how do we make it happen? And I don't want to leave that unanswered this time. Because part of what I think Needleman and Whitman and others have done is, I like the idea of the Ephata community because it talks about how they had conflict inside themselves and brought it to a reasonable resolution and reconciliation. But, I think we were talking last time and it struck me how many times folks said, yeah, but, these other people. I put that one image up last time of the QAnon shaman. And who was ready to go have a snack with that guy, right? But at the same time, you know, what we could do is we could imagine now someone who's driven by something. And he's had, I don't mean to pick on this one guy, he's very visible. We all know I'm talking about. But what is it that drives him? And if we can't afford, either as a collective society, but also as individuals, to even look at someone that we so vociferously disagree with or vociferously think was comical, and think that there's nothing else inside of there that we don't have to become reconciled with. And for that matter, he can't do that. But he may be ignorant of that. He may be lost to that. And trying to change that is something we can do each in ourselves, and then begin to be evangelists of it. Much like we would spread the message of Christ as expressing the gospel of the hope of our land. Well, I think it's St. Patrick's Day, and maybe I've talked too much, or maybe we're just tired. But there's a lot to chew on here. And I hope, I know it's a daunting book to read. So I encourage you to hold on to your copies, and I still got one in the office here. But hopefully, as we go through this, we're looking at the conclusion next week. It will whet your appetites to passages. But today, if there was one thing I could bring back, it would be the story of Peter Miller and this man that walked 60 miles in the snow to save someone's life who had made it a cottage industry of making fun of them and hating them. And seeing that it actually changed the heart of one of the greatest men of American history, George Washington. That's a story.
Father Patrick.
Yes, ma'am.
You know, I guess Miller was a common name, and I have not really searched out my ancestry that well, but my grandfather was a Miller, George Miller, and I understand he went back quite a ways
Hey,
within
Greg.
the American.
Greg?
Pardon me?
Oh, we're
Oh, no,
listening.
sorry.
Anyway, I'd have to, you know, I'm going to research it a little because of this book.
Could you feed the cats? Would you?
The cats are not taking no for an answer.
Careful, you'll be next.
Wow. Did you hear that, Pat? That's Pat Griffin.
We have to mute until we talk, I think.
No, I'm just teasing Pat. Apparently, if you don't feed the cats, you'll be next.
Yeah. They attack.
And you know how I feel.
My dogs would never do that to me. I don't care what they say. Well, anyway, guys, I'm going to send you all off here at 7:30 and with love and blessings, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And now go home in peace and have a joy. And I hope to see you face to face very, very soon. But if not, I hope to see you on Zoom next week for our conclusion. And don't forget to make the orders for soup.
Okay, yes.
Definitely.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Very good.
Bye. God bless you.
Thank you so much.
Happy St.
Thank you,
Patrick's
guys.
Day,
Thank you all for
everybody.
being there.
Good night.
Good night.